Good morning. In 1921, Dr. William Henry Griffith Thomas, an outstanding Anglican scholar and professor of Old Testament exegesis at Wycliffe College in Toronto, Canada, met with Dr. Lewis Sperry Chafer to consider and pray about creating a new seminary. In 1924, those prayers were answered, and the Evangelical Theological College, later to be called Dallas Theological Seminary, was born. Unfortunately, W.H. Griffith Thomas died that same year, but the lectureship that we began yesterday is a memorial to his commitment to the ideals of Dallas Theological Seminary. Each year, qualified lecturers are selected alternately by each of the divisions of the seminary: biblical studies, theological studies, and ministries and communications. The lectures consist of the presentation of scholarly papers on topics not normally covered in the seminary curriculum or at the same depth. This year, our speaker was selected by the Department of Old Testament Studies in the Biblical Studies Division. The annual lectures are generally published in BibSac, the seminary's quarterly theological journal. Over the years, many noted scholars have presented the Griffith Thomas lectures, men such as Henry Ironside, Frank Gabeline, Francis Schaeffer, J.I. Packer, F.F. Bruce, and Bruce Metzger. This year, it is our privilege to have with us Dr. Douglas Stuart, who will continue in that excellent tradition. 1964, Dr. Stuart received the Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard College. He spent 2 years in graduate study at Yale Divinity School and then returned to Harvard University in 1971, where he received a PhD degree. He currently serves as professor of Old Testament at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, where he has been since 1971. Professor Stuart is a scholar of the Old Testament, Assyrian and Babylonian languages and literature, and the cultures of the ancient Near East. He controls the use of 14 different languages, both ancient and modern. And at Gordon-Conwell, his courses include areas such as biblical languages, exegesis and interpretation, Old Testament survey and legal documents, and the historical, prophetical, and poetical books. I think that's just about everything, isn't it? Professor Stuart is active in several organizations and has served as co-chair of the Old Testament Colloquium for the Boston Theological Institute, a consortium of Boston's seminary and university biblical professors. He's also authored articles in major journals, anthologies, and magazines. In addition to pastoring several churches in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Professor Stuart has preached and taught worldwide. He is currently the senior pastor of Line Brook Church in Massachusetts. He has made many short-term mission trips and frequently ministers to gypsies in Eastern Europe. He and his wife Gail have 8 grown children. They reside in Bradford, Massachusetts, and have 2 tree farms in New Hampshire. Dr. Stuart, on behalf of the faculty and student body, again, we welcome you to Dallas Theological Seminary, and we thank you for your ministry to us this week. Would you please join me in welcoming him today?
Just a comment on the title of these translations, My Favorite Translations. It's not that I think that if it's my favorite, it's a mistranslation or a translation, and it's not that I think that I'm the arbiter of what makes a mistranslation or a translation wrong or right or whatever. It's just that I've always believed that if you could make a title that was a combination of somehow catchy and somehow reflective of the topic, and somehow interesting so that people would wonder, well, what's this all about? It would work. When Gordon Fee and I were trying to come up with a title for our book, which now is titled How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, we really spent weeks working on it. Everybody were asking people on the bus, I got any ideas for a title? Here's the book. What do you think? We were going everywhere. And finally I said to Fee, hey, I got an idea. What if we titled it How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth? Because you could theoretically spell it's both ways, IT''S or ITS. Oh, it'd be great. There's a little ambiguity there. It's kind of fun, and it's good. And he said, oh, it's great. So he said, I'll run it by Maudine, which is what he does with everything. His wife is actually the author of everything Fee writes. So he said, and then he emailed me back. Maudine likes it. No, we were gone. Well, I think half the sales of that book come from the title. The other half is because Fee actually knows something. So So it's wonderful to be able to talk about the Bible, and I'm talking with you about translation, and in some sense, even translation theory. Now, I know that not all of you know Hebrew, not all of you know Hebrew yet, not all of you know Hebrew as well as you're going to know it as you keep studying it and so on. Some of you will never learn Hebrew, but I'm going to try to say some things that I hope will be helpful for everybody. I'd like to try to let you in on what it is that we face, those of us who do translation work. And I've been involved in all kinds of translation work in all kinds of ways, on versions of the Bible and on projects where I had to translate for some publication, or in writing a commentary where it was expected that the commentator would produce a new translation, and so on. So I've been doing this kind of thing for a lot of years, thinking a lot about it, analyzing where I, in the past, made my mistakes, and why I didn't do a better job. Why is it that sometimes I have to say, oh no, why did I do that? That shouldn't have been the case. Why didn't I see what I needed to see in connection with that particular translation problem? So today, I want to discuss two places in the book of Hosea where I think we actually have some mistranslations in one particular version. And the first of these is Hosea 1:2, and I've just put some wording up there in a foreign language so as to give you a feel for the fact that this may have some erudition attached to it. I'm hoping that in some way you'll say, oh man, if he could even find that and know where to put it on his computer, just to show it to us, he must know something. No, actually what I've put there is the Hebrew of Hosea 1:2. For those of you who do know Hebrew, it's just very interesting in the way it starts off, because you have actually a feminine singular noun in construct to have the word tehillah. In construct to, and tehillah means beginning, so it's the beginning of something, and it's in construct to a clause. Yahweh, or the Lord, spoke through Hosea. Then it goes on from there. And that's not the part that I'm dealing with, but it's just very interesting to see a challenge like that, how rare it is, but not unheard of. There are a number of places where it happens, including Genesis 1:1, where you have a noun, reshif, in construct to a clause. And so the grammar right away of the book of Hosea is a kind of a challenge to any Hebrew student, and right away it involves having to think hard about how best to render into English what's going on, and it happens in every verse, not just this one, but in this one I think it happens in many interesting ways. So anyway, I won't tell you anything about the rest of the Hebrew because I'm not sure I can read it. No, actually I think I do. I think I do have a hunch of what it says. Now here's the deal. The new NIV, which is a great translation, says, when the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, and that's all fine, go marry a promiscuous woman, have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. Now, wouldn't you look at that and say, okay, this woman is promiscuous, and then they're just going to have some children, that's kind of incidental. But then there's the wife is going to be adulterous, and then the land is guilty of unfaithfulness. All these different words in Hebrew must lie behind a translation like this. But in fact, in this proposed translation that I've just caused to appear, is what I think actually the passage says to me in English. It's what, when I read the Hebrew and then say, how does that come out in English, doing my best to translate it? So the proposed translation is mine, and I say it ought to be, you can certainly say the Lord instead of Yahweh. Don't get hung up on that. That's just a kind of a convenience of making sure that I've rendered the Hebrew with a certain kind of solidarity to the actual wording. But when Yahweh began to speak through Hosea, Yahweh said to Hosea, marry a woman of prostitution. Notice I've put it in quotes. and have children of, and again in quotes, prostitution, because the land is completely involved in prostitution away from Yahweh. The reason for that proposed translation is that a word in Hebrew, zana, and it's in a couple of different forms, but nothing particularly confusing about that, in the original is used 4 times. Everything that's said by way of, quote, characterization of the wife that Hosea will marry, the children he will have, and the land they all live in is described by this single term in the original. Not a bunch of different terms that would translate out as different terms in English, but a single term. Now, what's at stake? And for those of you who weren't here yesterday, I do have to move quickly through a lot of this material because I don't want you to think too long about anything I say in case it's wrong. No, actually, there's just a lot I would love to try to cover for you, and so I will sort of zoom along. What's at stake? If the new NIV is correct, God told Hosea to marry someone sexually promiscuous, because that's the way it's done, and adulterous, both of those, and to have children, but the children that will come along eventually are just children. They're not characterized. They're left out of the characterization prostitution that is given in the original. But if the proposed translation is correct, then Hosea's wife and his children and his country, his nation, are all described as tainted by prostitution in quotes, which is a metaphor, and I'll talk about this further, for idolatry, for polytheistic idolatry, and each of them is considered tainted by that concept, by that fact, by that reality, abundant, sadly, in the northern Israel of Hosea's day, which he is inspired to call by the term that translates prostitution, zana, and its congeners in Hebrew. Now, I'm here criticizing a translation in the NIV, but it's not personal. I love the NIV. I use the NIV. I preach from the NIV every Sunday. Every Sunday, I teach a 1-hour adult Sunday school class, then I preach in the morning service, then I preach in the evening service, and it's all from the NIV. We have NIV pew Bibles in my church. I've introduced the NIV into congregations, and so I love it. I've done all kinds of things with the NIV. I've been a consultant for the NIV. In fact, let me tell you very quickly a story that's just still very vivid in my mind. It's 1971, and I'm working with the NIV translation team on 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we're sitting around a table and we're working on a whole bunch of passages, just verse after verse and passage after passage, and we've got a deadline, so we can't waste too much time. And there comes a point where all of us except one, now I can't even remember exactly who it was, maybe one of your faculty here, it was on the other side of the table and I've forgotten, so please forgive me instantly, but I don't think so. They all look too young. So I think they weren't here, they weren't there. But we came up, it was a consensus kind of thing, and there was the NIV, when it was originally done, was a committee translation, so the groups of people worked on it together or teams. And the team I was on was working away, and we came to some verse, and we decided to render something into English, all of us except one guy who said, no, that isn't the way to do it, it ought to be this way. And we all said, no, the way we got it is right. Let's write it down. No, he said, it ought to be, no, don't do it. That'll never communicate. That doesn't say, that's very boring, and so on and so on. It ought to be this way. And then the rest of us said, no, we're happy with what we do. I think that's the way to go. And he finally said, hey, all day long, you guys have disagreed with me, and I haven't won a single argument. You owe me one. So the chair of the committee says, okay, we'll give it your way. Now, I can't remember the verse anymore, and it was a long time before the published version came out, but it's very possible that somewhere in 1 Samuel, There is a translation that was done for the sake of a poor brother's self-esteem. Now that really is a true story. I'm telling you, it's true. I was there. Just like the old song goes, I was there when it happened, and I guess I ought to know. If the Lord saved me, well, I was there, I guess I ought to know. So there are a lot of things that happen to us, and it doesn't have to be a team. It can be an individual thing. It can be where you're rushing to get something done. If you've got a translation assignment and you're working away at it and you say, oh, I'm starting to fall behind and the deadline's coming. There's all kinds of things that can happen because we're human. But I happen to love the NIV. I think it sings, I think it's clear, I think it does such a great job. But it doesn't mean there can't be no mistakes in it. Of course there can be mistakes. So I am criticizing the version that I myself use all the time in this particular case because I think it needs to be improved upon. So what are the problems? Well, first, the NIV in Hosea 1:2, and I mean the new NIV, not the 1984. Many times they're exactly the same, but there have been some updating. So the new NIV, the one just out last year, uses 3 English terms, promiscuous, adulterous, and guilty of unfaithfulness, to render a single Hebrew term in a single verse. And that single Hebrew term shows up 4 times, modifying Hosea's wife, children, and land the very same way. Most of the versions have noticed that and have honored that and have said, this can't be accidental. This is an important pattern. But secondly, I think that the new NIV gives the impression that the original Hebrew would characterize the wife, the children, and the land in a variety of ways. That's what I would come away from if I didn't know what the original looked like. I'd just say, well, there's all these different ways. God inspired Hosea to hammer away at these various types of corruptions and apply them separately to these various groups in a kind of a collage of vocabulary. Now, look, everybody understands that it can be a serious mistake to translate a given word from the original into English always the same way. In these lectures, I'm looking at Hebrew into English, so that's what I'll be talking about, but you understand it would apply to Greek and Aramaic likewise. You just can't do that always. That depends on the context. It depends on what we call the semantic domain. What are you talking about when you're describing the particular thing that you want to describe? And if so, how do you do that in English? And you may not use the same English word. We all understand that. But in a single verse, when there's 4 repetitions of this particular Hebrew word, that's a different matter. So it's not really the case here. What then has happened? Well, first, I would argue that the new NIV ignores how the original includes Hosea's children in the sin that God condemns in the verse by the root zanah, which has to do with prostitution per se. So in other words, the original says that Hosea and his wife are to have, quote, children of prostitution. Now, we haven't yet talked about what does that mean, what does that connote, although I have hinted at it already. But just for the moment, think about the fact that the new NIV simply says, and have children. That's it. So they're just left out. Well, it changes the role and the identity of the children. It changes them for the better, one could say. They don't seem to be involved in the problem. They're not included. And you could argue that that's nice if you're one of the children. Trouble is, then if you go on and read the chapter, you're going to get such an awful name that you're going to be a weirdo for the rest of your life anyway. So God really didn't spare them in this particular case. But second, the new NIV says, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness. The literal translation of the original is, because the land is completely involved in prostitution. Very interesting. There's a lot added there. Like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of. And it simply says the land is completely involved in prostitution. Now, again, I'm putting prostitution in quotes all the time because I think it is intentionally a metaphor, and I'll talk more about that. Second problem, the NIV says, or additionally, not second problem, but let me additionally say that the original stresses the ubiquity of covenant-breaking idolatrous behavior. That's the point of it. This is a certain type of prophecy, and I'm getting to that as well. It's a special type of prophecy that we've got here. And the issue is idolatry, which breaks the covenant. And it's important to understand that that's what is being said here. The New NIV, I think, naturally is read to say only that the land is unfaithful in the way that an adulterous wife is unfaithful. Now, that's not saying nothing, but it's making a more limited assertion. In the way that an adulterous wife is unfaithful, that's how the land is unfaithful. That's less of an assertion than saying the whole land is thoroughly into prostitution. That's another kind of, another level of assertion. Third, the final two verses, the way the New NIV translates it, just says, guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. But in the Hebrew, which is there in parentheses, it really does say very clearly, I think, away from the Lord. It's gotten into prostitution away from the Lord, which gives a much clearer picture of departure from God. You break a covenant, you leave the Lord. When Israel broke its covenant, they went away. They took off, they departed. And the original connotes that, it shows it, it says it, whereas that gets sort of diminished, if not entirely covered over, in the New NIV. So I think the New NIV of Hosea 1:2 is not dynamic equivalency. Now, when I started working on the NIV as a translator, that's what we were encouraged to do. We thought a lot about dynamic equivalency. We debated it. How does it work? What's the point? Excuse me. I'm allergic to Hebrew. And the idea is not in dynamic equivalency that you start adding in commentary or something. It's just that you really, really, really try to say how normally, in normal modern English, do you say the same thing? What is it that causes your brain to say, yes, I see that in the Hebrew, and yes, I see that in the English, and it's the same thing. It's the same thing in both languages. Now, of course, we do it imperfectly. We're just humans. Our brains don't always work as well as they should, but that's what we're trying to do. And so I think the NIV in Hosea 1:2 actually departed from the commitment to strict dynamic equivalency to some degree. Fourth, it also, interestingly, this is a minor point, but hey, I'm talking about how hard we want to work on translation. And it's because every word that proceeds from the mouth of God is important to us, not just the bulk of them, but everyone. And a translator is saying to himself or herself all the time, I want every reader to know everything that God says. Nothing more, nothing less, but I certainly want them to get it. That's what a translator says. So in this case, the NIV happens to say this land. That's minor, but I think it's a little bit different from the way in the Old Testament the land is used. I think the land is a more inclusive kind of term. It's used a lot, and it has special connotations to it. So small detail, but it's there. Now, fifth, guilty of unfaithfulness certainly says something, but in my opinion, it's weaker, it's vaguer than saying is completely involved in prostitution. Zano tizne, using the good old infinitive absolute, which normally makes something very intense, says it's absolutely, or it's totally, or it's entirely, or it's really, or it's thoroughly, something like that. So I read the original to assert that the land is not just guilty of something, not just guilty of, but thoroughly characterized by it, totally into it, fully corrupted by it. That's what I think God said through Hosea. And thus, the point is that all Israelites, any woman Hosea would marry, Hosea himself, he could have said, woe is me, I'm a person of prostitution and I live in the country of prostitution. He could have said it that way. The same way that, I'm just parroting the way that Isaiah said about his own corruption as part of an unclean people, and so on. But any woman Hosea would marry would be characterized as any children they have. Not because the wife would literally be a prostitute, or not because the children would be either prostitutes in some way themselves, child prostitutes, or would be the children of prostitutes, thus illegitimate, but because they would be tainted by, they have to live with, have to put up with, have to suffer the consequences of, have to constantly fight against the ubiquitous, idolatrous, polytheistic garbage that the Israelites had gotten into. It was everywhere, and that's the power of the metaphor of that verse. Now, sixth, I think the verse in the New NIV leaves the impression that Hosea was commanded to do something that under other circumstances constitutes improper behavior, that is, marry a sexually promiscuous woman. And this is not just my idea. Last night, 3 of your very best students took me to dinner. And one of them, particularly sharp, said, what are you going to speak on tomorrow? And I said, I'm going to do Hosea 1:2 and Hosea. He said, great. He said, when I was in Bible college, one of my professors said to me, hey, be prepared for what God may call you to do. Because he told Hosea to marry a prostitute, and he may tell you to marry one too. So that student told me he made Hosea 1:2 his life verse. Just kidding around. So anyway, I think that's really quite an interesting challenge. And I don't think actually the grammar of the original says any such thing. He's not told to marry an actual prostitute. I have more to say and explain that. So, by the way, I have suggested that if you put quote marks around the word prostitution, you really help show that. Now, you know, Hebrew doesn't have quote marks. Ancient Hebrew had no quote marks. It didn't have a lot of things that we would call punctuation. But it certainly doesn't have those. And therefore, you have to infer where it is that something like quote marks might really show up. Now, a seventh thing, if you can't remember the first 6, great, because that means I've really snowed you and now you're just following along and under my spell. No, maybe some of you are taking notes of this. And if you are taking notes, this is 7th. In fact, if you're not taking notes, it's still 7th. Anyway, 7th. The original uses, the NIV, I want to talk about the new NIV, uses vocabulary that disconnects the verse from the rest of the book. It turns out, if you look at Hosea all the way through, if any of you who do know Hebrew read through Hosea in Hebrew, this word zanah keeps coming up and up and up. Hosea is not that long a book, but it comes up a total of 22 times in the book. Now, there are a couple of times when it is talking about various sins, including actual prostitution, but almost everywhere else, it's talking about the metaphorical idea. And I'm going to show you some examples of that metaphor shortly. So I would say it's Hosea's programmatic metaphor. It's the metaphor that God has specially caused him to use. And Hosea 1:2, therefore, is a programmatic verse that leads into the rest of the book, which is regularly and often, and sometimes it seems almost cloyingly, talking about the prostitution that's going on. All this prostitution's happening, and it's a way of describing polytheistic idolatry. That's what it's talking about. So, now, is the original too hard to translate? You could always ask the question, maybe that's it. Well, it really isn't. Look at the King James. It's very simple. Now, King James uses the more archaic language, Take thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. It's all there. All the things that I've been talking about, King James saw and consistently rendered. Or a more modern example, the ESV, also using whoredom. Take a wife of whoredom, children of whoredom, land commits great whoredom, forsaking the Lord. And many, many others are similar. So this isn't some mysterious thing. The vocab's not hard. That's not the problem. I actually think the old NIV was actually a little bit closer because it didn't have quite so many changes and variations. So it's take yourself adulterous wife, children of unfaithfulness. At least the children are somehow in there. The land is guilty of the vilest adultery. That's not bad, although I think the term zana really does not refer to adultery, but only to prostitution. It really does have a more limited value, and in the BibSac article that'll come out on this, you'll see my evidence for why that's so. So there again, I've put the Hebrew up there just to remind people that I actually theoretically know some. Okay, now here's some speculation. And speculation's very dangerous. Nevertheless, I happen to enjoy it now and again. So I'm going to do something very dangerous. I'm just guessing what might have caused the NIV to make the various changes it made. Well, I would think especially leaving the children entirely out. It says so clearly in the Hebrew, children of prostitution. Very natural way to translate that, just as those translations that I showed you and so many others do. Why just say, have children? Nothing else. I think a feeling that that's just got to be too harsh. It's sort of, God wouldn't really do that. He might condemn the adults, but not the poor kids. And so I just wonder if it wasn't a case of trying to figure out, assuming that perhaps if you're going to create the impression on the part of the reader that the children were into some form of sexual immorality in the family, let's just eliminate that possibility by simply redoing the wording. I don't know if that's the motivation or not. I have no doubt that whoever did it was very well motivated. They were just trying to do the right thing. But I think it was a mistake, like the mistakes that I myself have often made. So I certainly don't think that I am trying to produce a criticism that is in some way devoid of continuity with what I myself often do. So when I do these kinds of things, when I produce these kinds of articles that the lectures are précis of, I'm simply shouting at myself, watch out, be careful. I'm reminding myself of how it can happen even to the best. So maybe the NIV made the changes out of compassion, but the original doesn't do that. It doesn't leave them alone. It says they are children of prostitution, Yaldei Zanunim. There, I pronounced some Hebrew for you. That ought to prove that I know what I'm doing. Okay. Gomer's title, Woman of Prostitution, is symbolic. So are the children's names are symbolic. But it's important to understand this fact. There are three ways to say prostitute in Hebrew. You can say zona, you can say isha zona, a woman who is a prostitute, and you can say kadesha, which means a shrine or temple prostitute. Hosea doesn't use any of those words. What Hosea uses is another kind of terminology. And furthermore, he uses it of the land. And as far as we know, very few people will pay to have sex with land. So I'm just saying. Now, you know what has happened? All kinds of liberals have said, whoa, well, we know what's going on here. And you know, a few evangelicals have followed them, usually only slightly. And they said, we know what's going on here. Hosea, like all the ancient Israelite prophets, thought he got messages from God. He didn't really, but that's what he thought. And so he said, you know, I married a woman and she turned out to cheat on me and she's been out selling her body and so on. But I thought God had told me that she was the one. Now, you know, we Christians, we like to think that God has told us that our spouse is right. We like to think we've obeyed the Lord So it's understandable, it's natural, so that he might have thought that, they say. And so when he found out that she was just cheating on him, he went back and retold his story. He thought through his story. He said, yes, God did want me to do this. I was still obedient to him, and he actually wanted me to have it work out this way, because this will be my opportunity to show that my life is like his life with unfaithful Israel. In the same way that Israel's the bride of the Lord, likewise my bride cheated on me, so it happened to him. I can identify in that way. But we need to appreciate the fact that there are lots of places in the Bible where this same term, to prostitute, is really standard language for, metaphorical, of course, but standard language for breaking the national covenant with the Lord. That's what it is. It's all over the place in Ezekiel. Ezekiel uses zana many more times than Hosea does, but it starts in the Pentateuch. It starts early on as a terminology that the prophets follow because they are so consistent with the Pentateuch. Now, in terms of flaws, form analysis, I think, is a problem because this is an enactment prophecy. This is one of those things where a prophet does something, some actions that people can observe and appreciate and ask questions about. And so chapter 1 is full of those. Even the naming of his children with oddball names would cause everybody he'd meet on the street, or at least they'd meet the children on the street, what's your name, little girl? My name is Not Loved. What? That gets a conversation going. That's an opportunity for a message. What's your name, kid? Jezreel. That would be like naming a kid Pearl Harbor. And he says, what? What's your name? Pearl Harbor, sir. Yeah, okay. Anyway, it's like that. So if you want to understand all of this, by the way, just read my commentary on Hosea. In fact, you should buy it in large quantities. Great witnessing tool. I recommend a case at a time. Leave it in restaurants. Leave it at bus stations. Hand it out on street corners. Who knows how the Lord may use it. Anyway, okay, back to reality. Symbolism is the default method in an enactment prophecy, just as it is in apocalyptic. Structure flaws. It's a programmatic verse. It gets going themes in the book, and that's terribly important. Lexical content flaws. Prostitution is generally figurative in the Old Testament, and certainly in the prophetical books. Grammar. Now again, if you really want to follow all this, you're going to read the BibSac article and have a chance to think it through and see it. So I am rushing through it. I understand that. You will still appreciate the fact that I'm just laying out generally what's happening here, but I'm doing it faster than a person can really give it thorough consideration. It's also a genitival construction to an abstract noun. The word that's used for prostitution is a very consciously abstract formation, the masculine plural, which accounts for about 90% of all abstracts in Hebrew. Also, literary context flaws. I think chapters 1 and 3 involve two different women, and I'm going to talk about that very soon, just a couple of minutes. Biblical context flaws. I think that what people don't see if they see the new NIV translation of Hosea 1:2 is the dependence on the language of the Mosaic covenant. And then theology. The real question here is, who had a marriage problem? Was it Hosea? Is that what we're supposed to read? Are we being let in on a guy's marriage problems? Or was the real issue that God had a problem with his people? And they were, well, I think if you read all of Hosea 1 through 3, that's where you end up. Now, quickly, to a complementary and related translation in chapter 3, verse 1. There it is, very simple. It says, go again, love a woman. Or New NIV, go show your love to your wife again. See what they've done? They've really firmly determined what it means. I would say it just says, again, go love a woman, or go show love to a woman, or whatever. Now, if you insert a commentary into a translation, are you helping? Some people would say yes. Some people would say, great idea. The translator thinks, oh, if I don't do this, people won't get it. This is complicated. This is tricky. Who's being loved? And who, again, is the person who's the target of this? I need to spell it out. So I got a couple of interesting illustrations that I want to end with. First, General Douglas MacArthur of World War II, his famous statement as he left the Philippines, "I shall return." That's what he said. Now, that's a very brief statement. That's not a lot of words. What does it mean? When's he going to return? How's he going to return? What's he going to return for? So many people would ask. So suppose you're a translator and you say, I need to make this clear to the people reading my translation. So I'm going to write, MacArthur said, I'm leaving the Philippines now, but when the tide of war is turned, I'll bring back far stronger American fighting forces, defeat the Japanese occupiers, liberate the Philippines. Well, he was talking about those kinds of things generally, probably, apparently. But what harm could happen? Well, first, he actually didn't say that whole bunch of words. He said only, I shall return. Had a very limited vocabulary, poor guy. Secondly, it obscures the power of the original. Sometimes brevity is important. It's powerful. It has a punch to it. It's memorable. So you've got to be very careful not to add terminology in thinking that you're clarifying. If God didn't do it in the original, why should we feel this obligation? We've got to be very careful about that. I think that's an issue always for a translator. And there are translators who would certainly disagree with me, but that's what I'm pushing for. Be very careful not to insert commentary into translation. And then finally, I think actually this quote translation with all these words and commentary inserted is limiting because MacArthur left it unlimited. Maybe it would be coalition forces. Maybe by that time the Russians and the British could join us in liberating the Philippines and so on. I mean, at the time there was discussion of all of that. And maybe there'd be other kinds of things that would happen and when he'd return and so on. So the original I shall return is actually more powerful, more comprehensive than the limiting commentary inserted. That's what I think happens. I have a second illustration. I happen to live in Massachusetts on the New Hampshire border, so I can drive in about 5 minutes to New Hampshire, where we do often because there's no sales tax in New Hampshire and I am cheap. So anyway, New Hampshire has on its license plates its state motto, live free or die. That's the New Hampshire state motto, live free or die. And surveys show it's the best remembered state motto. There are a lot of really weird state mottos. In fact, I have a footnote in the article for this listing some of the ones that I think are really cockamamie. But anyway, New Hampshire has live free or die. Now, a translator could say, okay, let me flesh this out. Here's the way to translate that. Here in New Hampshire, we believe that life is not lived at a high level of personal, social, economic, religious, political freedom, too miserable. We're willing to die fighting to prevent that, and so on. And if we had to, we would not live without freedom because death is preferable to a life without freedom. You could do that, but I'm sure it wouldn't fit on a license plate. So what's wrong with it? Well, it's historically inaccurate. You can't say that's a translation. It's not. That's a commentary. That's something different. That's a rewrite even, not even merely a paraphrase. And so it's not on the license plate. So if a translator said, here's what was on the New Hampshire license plates way back then, it's not true. Secondly, it obscures the power of the original because live free or die is actually a kind of a proverb. It's a kind of an epigram that would fit with what we call proverbs in the Bible. And those are intended to be so laconic as to require you to think them through. And as you think them through, you're learning them. It's very, very valuable. Very useful to have that brevity. Furthermore, it's way too long to be memorable. I couldn't cite half of it, and I wrote that, the crazy thing. And then it's also too limited. It actually is specific, whereas the conceptual ground of live free or die may have any number of wonderful applications. And I close with this little remark. My wife and I often eat dinner at a little diner in New Hampshire. It's not far from our home. And in New Hampshire, people have gotten to love the expression live free or die. And they laugh at it and they mock it and they fool around with it, but it really does. There's a kind of a heartfelt embracing of it. So the diner we eat at is named the Live Free or Diner. Anyway, those are just a couple of simple illustrations of the way that you got to think through. Do we add a commentary? And I think that's been done in chapter 3 and in the article. If you choose to read it in BibSac when it comes out, you'll see more analysis of why I think that's so. Please join me in prayer. Father, we love your word because we love you, and we know that you love us through your word. It is one of the ways that you love us. We remember from the New Testament how obviously the Lord Jesus loved your word. And we want to imitate him, so make us lovers of it. How carefully he used your word, how respectfully he treated it. May we do the same, modeling after him. How faithfully he preached it and taught it wherever he went. May we do that also, using his example to guide us. And how he said people live on it, how he revered it, and how he sought to obey it in his life. And may we do the same with the help of our faithful Savior. In his name we pray. Amen.